Okay, we're going to talk about seed saving for peas today. This is a really good one for beginners. It's a really easy thing to seed save from. And by peas, we're talking about snap peas, snow peas, potting peas, all of those yummy, usually grown over winter and eaten early spring, late winter, early spring here. So all of those. They're all self-pollinators, which means you don't have to worry about them crossing. When you're planting them in the garden, you just want to keep them maybe 3 to 5 metres apart, so if you're growing more than one variety, so that you can tell and remember which one's which and they don't get confused as they're growing. And you don't need very many. One plant will give you viable seed. Probably 5 to 10 would be very good for just maintaining the genetics, so you'll have good plants in the future. And if you're looking after a really, really rare variety and you want to keep all of the genetic diversity, then you really only need to grow about 20. And that's plenty, and it's not very many, and most of us can fit all of those seeds, or all of those plants into our gardens. When we're growing for seed, we grow peas exactly the same as we do for eating. You don't need to worry about extra spacing. They will be in the ground using your trellis or your ground space for a little bit longer than normal, because you're going to have to wait for them to finish fully maturing on the plant before picking. As seed savers, we should always be thinking about picking the best plants to get the seed from. So you're always looking for the ones that best show the characteristics of that variety. So if you're saving from a snow pea, you're going to want to look for the plants with the best snow pea pods and keep those. You may want to select away from any disease. So if you've got a lot of, say, powdery mildew on your pea plants, then you're going to want to look for ones that aren't showing powdery mildew and getting seed from those. Selecting with peas is usually pretty easy. We're just making sure that the flower colour is correct. If we're growing a purple flowered one, we want to make sure that we don't start to get flowers that are incorrect, so that we're trying to keep the varieties to what they should be that we expect. When we're harvesting seed for peas, it's actually a long way past when we would normally harvest them for eating. We want them when their pods are crunchy and brown, not that luscious green, fresh thing that we would want to eat. So if you're growing on say a climbing pea, you're probably going to just wait for each individual pod to get to that crunchy brown and pick them. If you're growing bush peas, you might actually wait until the plant has got most of its pods in that crunchy brown, and then just cut the entire plant and harvest it that way rather than pea by pea. The big enemy of seed savers at this point, was just as we're coming up to harvest, is rain. We don't want any of the pods that have got to that crunchy brown to get re-wet again in the garden. That's when mould will get onto our seed and on the pods, and when the peas might actually re-sprout in the pods in very bad cases. So we want to harvest them as soon as they're brown if we know that there's rain coming. So when we know rain's forecast, it's time to rush out and check your peas. So here's some bush peas that we harvested the entire plants of. They were spread out to dry on some old screen doors, and now they're all nice and dry and crunchy and ready for processing. There's a couple of ways we can tackle this. We can pull it out and do each pod by hand, as I'm kind of doing here, or we can also wrap up the bag and jump on them gently, but jump on them and try and crack all these open, and then we can sieve the seeds out from the bottom of the bag. And here's some we harvested from a climbing pea. This is a sugar snap, and that we harvested those pods individually one by one as they became dried on the plant. So getting the seed out is a very simple process. You can do it by hand. And here's one bag of pea seeds that our seed savers group cleaned before Christmas. They're all ready to go. So a group of us potted all of those. You'll notice that these look a bit different to the ones that you were just looking at. This is a snow pea, and you'll notice they're quite round. The one we were looking at before is a snap pea, and they're almost little cubes. They're very dried and wrinkled, and that's a difference in how much sugar is in the peas. Sugar holds moisture. When the moisture dries, they become much more wrinkled. So the really sweet ones will be very wrinkled. And there's an excuse for me to have plenty of wrinkles. Okay, so what do you need to know to store your peas really well? And it's drying them, getting them really dry. Just because the pod feels crunchy doesn't necessarily mean that your peas are dry enough for storage. They hold quite a lot of moisture. One of the easy ways to tell is to use a hammer. We'll cover some other techniques in a different video and ways in which you can make sure and get your seed really dry. But for peas, it's fairly straightforward. So this is how we would test for dryness, or how we can test for dryness with peas. I picked these ones a little bit earlier today. There was a nice brown crackly pod, but they were only picked today, so I'm not expecting them to be dry enough. But here's the test. That's definitely not dry enough. They're squashing. That's not what we're looking for in a dry pea. So these should have been dried a lot more. Here's some that were processed some weeks ago, and hopefully these ones are dry enough. Oh, yes, we can see that. It's shattered everywhere. And that's what we're looking for. Although it does feel just a little bit soft still, maybe just a bit more drying, but those are very close. If they smash nicely when we give them a good tap, that's a really good indication of drying. If they squash, then the seed needs to be dried some more. Let's try it with a corn kernel. And that one has crumbled, nicely dry. Some different beans, just in case. Also nicely dry. I'm glad to see that my collection of beans are mostly quite well dried for storage. If they're not dry enough, you need to put them in a paper bag and put them in a dry spot and keep them for quite a bit longer while they dry out, and it could take weeks until they're dry enough that they shatter, and then you can store them away until next year. If you put those damp ones in a jar, you're going to have mould. Okay, we've finished processing, our seed's dry, we've put it all in a jar. There's one last thing we need to do, because there's a fair likelihood that some insect has laid eggs in one or more of these, and we put this jar away. Then next season when we go to plant, we might find that there's lots of half-eaten peas in our jar rather than really good seed. So the easy way to deal with that is to put them in the freezer for 48 to 72 hours, so 3 days for peas, and that will kill any insects or insect eggs that are in there. I can't stress enough, it has to be absolutely dry before it goes in the freezer, because as we all know, water expands when it freezes, and if there's moisture inside those peas and it expands inside, it's going to also destroy your seeds. But get rid of the pests, they'll be perfect next year. So that's all you need to know about saving seeds from pea plants.